Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1. It was a stormy night. The kind that rattles your bones and makes you wonder if the world is coming to an end. The wind howled, the kind of sound that creeps into your chest, twisting like cold fingers around your heart. I had been trying to sleep for hours, tossing and turning in my bed, the rain pelting against the window, the darkness swallowing everything around me. My mind raced with thoughts, mostly about work, the bills piling up, the endless responsibilities I couldn't seem to outrun. But as the clock ticked past midnight, something felt wrong, like the house itself was breathing, sighing, waiting for something. Or maybe it was just me alone, too tired to fight off the feeling of dread that crawled up my spine. It was then that I first noticed it. A shadow. It was so faint at first, just a blur, a shape that barely registered through the corner of my eye. I was lying on my side, staring out the window at the rain, but when I shifted my gaze toward the curtain, I saw it. The shadow. It was standing still, behind the thin white fabric, just out of reach, like something waiting, holding its breath. I try to brush it off as nothing, just the wind, or maybe the trees outside swaying in the storm. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This felt different. This felt like something else, something more. I turned on my side and pulled the blanket up to my chin, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. But the shadow remained, unmoving, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. My heart pounded in my chest, but I told myself to calm down. It was nothing. The storm outside had to be messing with my mind, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was watching me. I slowly reached out and turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into complete darkness, hoping that whatever it was would vanish with the light. But when I opened my eyes, there it was again, the shape barely visible but undeniably there, pressing against the curtain like it was trying to get in. The wind howled louder, a piercing sound that seemed to rattle the windows, but the shadow, it didn't move. I felt my throat tighten, my pulse quicken. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I couldn't look away from it. It was as if it were connected to me somehow, as if it knew I was watching, as if it was waiting for me to do something, anything that might make it move. I pulled the covers up over my head, but it didn't help. My mind raced, a storm of thoughts swirling through my head. It's just a trick of the light, I told myself. I'm just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew it was real. Then, suddenly the power went out. Everything went silent. For a moment, I sat in the dark, my heart pounding. The only sound in the room, the relentless tapping of the rain against the window. I waited, listening for any sign that the shadow was gone. But all I could hear were my own shallow breaths and the beating of my heart, as if the world had shrunk down to just this moment. I had to get up. I had to see what it was. I pulled myself out of bed, the floor cold against my feet, my breath quick and shallow. The darkness felt suffocating, like it was swallowing me whole. My feet shuffled across the floor toward the window, every step seeming louder than the last. as if the darkness itself was growing impatient with my hesitation. When I reached the window, I pulled the curtains back, my hands trembling, the cold air hitting my skin like a slap. But there was nothing there, nothing at all. The window was empty. The rain was still falling, the wind still howling, but the shadow had vanished. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the blackness of the storm, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But there was nothing, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Just the sound of the rain, steady and relentless, and the cold wind that seemed to whisper its way through the cracks of the house. I closed the curtain and returned to bed, still shaken, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. My mind refused to quiet down, no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it had been nothing, that I had imagined it. But I couldn't forget the feeling, the way it had felt as if the shadow had been waiting for me to notice it, watching me. And then it came again, the footsteps, soft at first, almost imperceptible. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone was walking around the room, inching toward me. The sound of footsteps on the old wooden floor, creaking with every step, was the only thing I could hear. No rain, no wind, just those slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was creeping closer, drawing near. I turned slowly, my eyes darting toward the door. There was nothing there. The room was empty. I could still hear the footsteps, but they didn't belong to anyone I knew. I bolted out of bed, my heart racing as I scanned the room in the dark. I couldn't see anything. No shadow, no figure, no sign of anyone else. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming, moving closer, like they were circling me, waiting for me to make a mistake, to show some sign of weakness. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of my room, down the hallway, my mind a blur of fear. But when I reached the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, sitting in the corner, was a shadow. It was back, lurking in the corner of the room, just out of the light's reach, as if it had been waiting for me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything to get away from it. But I was frozen, my body unwilling to obey my mind. The shadow didn't move. It just sat there waiting, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I'm not sure how long I stood there, staring into the empty corner, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But eventually, I forced myself to move. I had to leave, to get out of the house, to escape. But every step I took was met with a feeling I couldn't shake. The feeling that it was still there, following me, watching me, waiting for me to come back. I never stayed in that house again. I left that night, my heart heavy with the knowledge that someone was still waiting there behind the curtains. And even now, as I sit in the dark, I can still feel those eyes on me, watching, waiting. Every night, the shadow comes back, and I swear to God, it's getting closer. Story 2. It was one of those nights where you could feel the storm pressing against you, the kind that fills the air with an oppressive weight. The wind howled outside my cabin like a wolf in search of prey, and the thunder, it wasn't the usual rumble. It was deep, angry, a sound that felt like it was coming straight from the belly of the earth. echoing through my bones. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders and lying still in my bed, hoping the noise would drown out my thoughts. But it didn't. I was too far from town, too far from anyone, and the isolation pressed down on me like a suffocating hand. I had been planning this trip for weeks, hoping for some peace and quiet, a chance to clear my head. What I hadn't expected was for the storm to come out of nowhere, a violent force of nature that seemed to mock my solitude. The power flickered twice before it finally went out, leaving me in total darkness, with only the faint glow of the moon through the thick clouds to guide me. The wind seemed to get worse as the minutes dragged on, battering the wooden walls of the cabin as if it wanted to tear it apart. I felt my pulse quicken, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't a child, I told myself. This was just a storm, a bad one, sure, but still a storm. Then, just as I was beginning to convince myself that I was being foolish, I heard it. A whisper. It was so faint at first I thought I might have imagined it. I strained my ears, trying to listen, but the wind was too loud. Then it came again, clearer this time, so clear that it almost felt like someone was standing just outside the door right next to me. Jess. My name. Soft, almost tender, but with an unmistakable urgency to it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, as if my body knew something my mind didn't want to accept. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but even as I repeated that to myself, I could feel it, a coldness creeping into the room, something that wasn't just from the storm. Jess, I froze. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a command, a plea. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the door, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Who would be out there? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the storm was so intense that even the most dedicated traveler would have turned back. And yet, here it was, my name, called out into the dark by someone or something I couldn't see. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and I told myself that it was nothing. The wind had to be carrying voices from the woods. It had to be, but it wasn't over. I held my breath, waiting for the next sound, and then it came again, louder this time. It wasn't a whisper anymore, but a low, insistent voice, urgent, demanding. Jess, open the door. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, as if whatever was out there had cast some kind of spell over me. My fingers trembled where they gripped the blankets, and my mind raced through 100 different scenarios, each more ridiculous than the last. It had to be someone playing a prank, I thought. Maybe someone from the town had followed me up here, toying with me in the storm. But the voice wasn't right. It was too hollow, too strange. There was something wrong with it, something wrong with the way it called my name. And then the whispers started again. They circled the cabin, moving from the window to the door, across the walls and under the floor. It was as if something was trying to get inside, something that had no business being there. The air grew heavier with each passing second, thick and cold, and I could hear my heart thudding in my ears. I wanted to call out, to shout, to beg for help, but my throat was tight, my words caught in some invisible grip. I could only listen as the whispers grew louder, angrier. The wind howled in a fury, rattling the windows and making the walls groan with the pressure. The sound was deafening now, as if the very cabin itself was about to be torn apart. But the whispers didn't stop. They were everywhere, closing in around me, as if whatever was out there was just waiting for me to make a mistake, to open that door. I pressed myself deeper into the bed, pulling the covers over my head, hoping to drown out the sound. But no matter what I did, the whispers only grew louder. I could feel them like cold fingers brushing against my skin, caressing my face, my neck. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. The night dragged on in a slow, suffocating crawl. I must have drifted off at some point, though I couldn't remember when. The storm raged on outside, but in the cabin, everything was eerily quiet. No more whispers, no more voices, just the steady beat of the rain against the windows and the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. It was as if the storm had never been there at all, as if the events of the night were nothing more than a bad dream. When the first rays of light filtered through the windows, I finally dared to move. I got out of bed, my legs shaky beneath me, and I made my way to the door. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I had to know. The mud outside the cabin was still soft from the storm, and I stepped carefully as I approached the door. When I looked down, my breath caught in my throat. There, right in front of the door, was a single footprint. It was small, too small to be mine, but it wasn't just the size that sent a chill through me. It was the fact that it was barefoot. The imprint was clear, the toes pressed deeply into the ground, as if the person, the thing, had been standing there for a long time waiting. I backed away, my stomach twisting with dread. There had been no one out here. I was sure of it. The nearest neighbor was miles away. No one could have come this far in the storm, not without getting soaked to the bone. But someone had been here. Someone had been standing outside my cabin, whispering my name into the storm, waiting for me to open the door. I turned and slammed the door shut behind me, and I never went back to that cabin. Story 3. The storm came out of nowhere. One moment, the sky was overcast, a dull gray that made everything seem a little off. And then, within seconds, it was a fury of wind and rain. It felt like the whole world was about to crack open, the trees outside my grandmother's old house twisting and groaning in the wind, their branches clawing at the glass like fingers desperate to get inside. It was late, far past midnight, and I was alone in that creaky house, nestled deep in the woods, miles away from anyone. I had come for a weekend visit, hoping to escape the bustle of the city and the chaos that clung to my everyday life. Grandma was never one for technology, and her house wasn't much different. No Wi-Fi, no television, nothing that would distract me from the quiet. But that quiet, now, felt unnatural. The kind of silence that seems to press against your eardrums, forcing you to listen harder than you want to. As I lay in bed, the wind howling outside, I tried to ignore the creaks of the house. Old houses make sounds. They settle, they shift with the weather. I told myself it was just the house talking to itself, the way it always did. But it was hard to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. Something was off. Then I saw him. It wasn't a blur or a trick of the light. No, it was too real for that. There was an old man standing on the porch. Not standing like someone who had come to visit or ask for help, but standing still, unnaturally still, as if he had been placed there, almost frozen. His eyes, pale blue and sunken, were locked onto me through the window. He stood there in the rain, unmoving, with the wind lashing at his tattered clothes. The rain beat down on him, his hair plastered to his head, his face a strange mask of emptiness. I wasn't sure how long I had been staring back at him when the chill crept through me, a deep, crawling sensation that twisted in my chest. My heart thudded loudly in my ears. The man's face was expressionless, but something about his stare unsettled me. It was almost as if he were waiting for something, waiting for me. The cold dread that filled my veins made it hard to breathe. I tried to convince myself I was just tired imagining things. But the longer I looked, the more I realized something wasn't right. The storm had made the whole world seem strange, but this was beyond strange. This was wrong. I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking. The screen remained black. Dead. Of course it was dead. I cursed under my breath, my fingers fumbling in the dark as I tried to turn it on, but nothing happened. The phone had been fine when I came up here. I hadn't even been using it, just sitting quietly, enjoying the absence of noise. I tried calling my grandmother's room, but no answer. I wasn't sure if she was asleep or if she had even heard me. The house was too big, too isolated, and her room was on the second floor, far from where I was. I was supposed to feel safe here. This was my grandmother's home. After all, the place where I spent summers as a kid, where I had run barefoot through the woods and stayed up late with her, talking about everything and nothing at all. But tonight, with the storm battering the windows and that old man standing on the porch, it felt like I had stepped into another world, one I didn't belong to anymore. I needed to do something. I couldn't just lie there, staring at him like a fool. Slowly, I got out of bed, my feet cold against the hardwood floor. My legs felt like jelly, and I stumbled as I moved toward the door. My fingers brushed the doorknob, but I hesitated. What was I doing? Why was I even thinking about going out there? There was no reason for an old man to be standing in the middle of a storm, in the middle of nowhere. It didn't make sense, but the pressure of his gaze, the way his eyes bored into me through the window, made it feel like I had no choice. I opened the door. The wind hit me like a wall, and I felt the weight of it press against me, as if trying to keep me from stepping outside. But I pushed against it, my feet crunching against the wet gravel as I moved onto the porch. The storm was fierce now, rain slicing through the air, the kind of rain that made everything feel soaked to the bone in seconds. The porch, however, was empty. I stepped forward, squinting into the rain, looking for any trace of the old man. The world was a blur of water and shadow, and there was nothing in sight. The wood beneath my feet was slick, but the man, he was gone. I walked further into the rain, my heart pounding in my chest, hoping that I had somehow imagined the whole thing. But no, the porch was empty. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone at all. Just the relentless storm roaring around me. I spun around, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Had I been wrong? Had I imagined the whole thing? No, I couldn't have. I had seen him. I knew I had seen him. I turned back toward the door, but as I did, my eyes caught something in the corner of the porch. A patch of ground, freshly wet, that seemed disturbed, A single footprint. It was small, almost delicate, as if it had been left by someone who had been standing there for much longer than I had thought. I stared at it for a long moment, the wind howling in my ears, the rain lashing harder against the house. And then, without another thought, I slammed the door shut behind me, locked it, and bolted for my grandmother's room. She was awake by the time I reached her, sitting up in bed with a concerned look on her face. I couldn't speak for a moment. The words wouldn't come. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady but tired. "Grandma, there was an old man on the porch in the storm. He was staring at me." My voice shook, the words tasting like they didn't belong in my mouth. She frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "An old man? Honey, no one's been here. You're safe. The storm is just playing tricks on you. You've been under a lot of stress lately, haven't you?" I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the chill that still gripped me, the feeling that something had been out of place, that something had been wrong, wouldn't let go. The storm raged on through the night. The wind shook the windows. The trees groaned under its force. But the old man was gone. I never saw him again. But every time I visit Grandma now, when the storm picks up, I can't help but wonder. I can't help but feel the weight of his eyes still on me, just beyond the window. And I can't shake the feeling that one day, in another storm, he'll be back, waiting. Story 4. I wasn't sure if I had drifted off or not. The storm had been pounding against the house for hours, the wind howling like something lost, desperate to find its way home. I could hear the trees groaning under the pressure, their branches whipping against the windows. The sound was almost comforting, almost. It was one of those nights when sleep slips away, leaving you stranded in that odd in-between state. Your body's heavy, but your mind won't shut up. I tossed, I turned, I stared at the ceiling. But there was something about the way the storm rattled the glass that kept my eyes fixed to the window. I felt unsettled. There was no good reason for it. The house was solid. The lights were on. Everything was fine. But there was something, a feeling, a gnawing suspicion. It was that reflection that caught my attention first. You know how sometimes you can see the reflection of something out of the corner of your eye, and for a second, you think it's just a trick of the light? That's what happened. I glanced at the glass and saw the storm. Rain streaking down the window, trees bending under the force of the wind. But something was wrong. I felt it in my chest like a weight, a heavy pressure that didn't belong. The reflection didn't match the world I knew. I didn't want to look, but my body had other ideas. My eyes locked onto the glass, unable to break away. In the reflection behind me, I saw it. A figure, tall, pale, wrong. It stood there just behind me, as if it had been there all along. The shape was dark, but I could still see its outline. Too tall, too still, and far too unnatural. Something about it made my blood run cold, like my brain couldn't fully process what it was seeing. It was like it didn't belong in this world, like it was a mistake, a crack in reality. The figure's head tilted slightly, and though I couldn't see its face, I could feel it. The eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, were on me. My heart began to hammer in my chest, a loud, frantic thud against my ribcage. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should move or stay still, or even if I could move at all. My breath caught in my throat. The room, the house, everything seemed to hold its breath with me. I turned. The room was empty. Just the same four walls, the same furniture, the same peace. But that was impossible, wasn't it? That thing, whatever it was, had been right behind me. I had seen it. I could feel it. My chest tightened. I quickly glanced back at the window, hoping it had just been some kind of sick trick. But no, it was still there. The figure was closer now, pressing against the glass, as if it had taken a step forward. The outline was clearer now. I could see the way its body distorted the rain outside, how its pale form pressed against the pane. Its head tilted again, but this time it was more than just an empty shape. It was watching me. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if it were savoring the fear it had planted inside me. My breath caught again, and I fought to suppress the rising panic. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. It was as if my body had betrayed me, frozen in place, my limbs numb from some invisible force. The wind howled outside, louder now, pressing against the house like the thing outside wanted to get in. The rain lashed the window with such force that it sounded like 1,000 tiny hammers striking the glass. And the figure, whatever it was, didn't move. It just stood there closer now. Its face, if you could call it a face, pale and featureless, but somehow still twisted with malice. I couldn't look away. I couldn't breathe. In the pit of my stomach, a horrible realization washed over me. It wasn't just in the reflection. It wasn't just the glass. That thing was in the room. It was with me. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, as if something were pressing down on it. I didn't know if it was the weight of fear or something else, but I couldn't force a sound out. The only thing I could hear, above the storm and my racing heart, was the sound of my breath, shallow and quick. And then it moved, not the way a person would move, not the way anything should move. It was as if the figure didn't walk. It glided, an unnatural smoothness to its movement. Its head swiveled ever so slightly, the reflection twisting and warping as it shifted. I felt it before I saw it. A cold chill, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones, makes you ache from the inside out. I could feel it standing behind me, breathing, waiting. I knew I should have turned around. I knew I should have run, but I couldn't. It was as if the very idea of moving, of looking away, would be the last thing I did. My mind screamed for me to react, but I couldn't. The figure's outline became clearer in the glass. Its face, still featureless, seemed to twist as if forming something. A mouth? A nose? It felt like the reflection was stretching, warping, pulling itself into something new. But then the wind rattled the house again, and just as quickly as it had formed, the figure retreated. It melted back into the shadows. My heart slammed in my chest, so hard it almost hurt. The figure was gone from the glass, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. The storm outside raged louder, as if mocking me. I didn't know how much time passed. Seconds? Minutes? Hours? But finally, I gathered enough strength to turn my head. The room was still empty. No one was there. The reflection in the window was just the storm, the rain, the trees bent low. Nothing more. But I knew. It had been real. I had felt it. I had seen it. It wasn't gone. It was still there somewhere, watching, waiting. And I realized, with a growing dread, that it had never really been outside. It had always been in the reflection, and it was never going to leave. Story 5. It was one of those nights that felt like it would never end. The kind where the rain falls in sheets, as if the sky itself is breaking apart, pouring out all its anger onto the earth below. I had been driving for hours, alone on a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever, surrounded by nothing but thick woods on either side. The wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, swishing back and forth in a desperate rhythm, but it was no use. The rain had turned the world into a blur of gray, and I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. I wasn't scared at first. After all, the road was well traveled, right? But as the minutes passed, the storm grew stronger. The windshield wipers began to squeak, battling the torrential downpour, and my headlights cut through the rain like knives, but they didn't do much to illuminate the road. There was something about the darkness of the night and the endless beating of the rain against the car that felt off. The kind of feeling you get when you're not alone, but there's no one around. Then, without warning, my car sputtered and jerked. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, but the engine gave a final cough and died. The sudden silence was deafening, and the weight of the storm seemed to swallow me whole. I stared at the steering wheel for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My car had never done this before. I tried turning the engine over again, but nothing. Just the hollow click of the key turning in the ignition. Panic began to creep in. The rain was relentless now, pounding on the roof and windows, as though trying to tear the car apart. I tried calling for help, but the signal was weak, nothing more than an empty buzz in my ear. I checked my phone, no bars, not a single one. Great. This wasn't just a mechanical failure. This was bad. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call anyone, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to keep warm, but the dampness had already crept under my skin. My mind raced, thinking of what to do next. Should I get out and walk? The thought of trudging through that downpour, in the middle of nowhere, with no lights to guide me, made my stomach turn. No, I couldn't do that. Not alone. Not out here. I glanced at the rearview mirror, hoping, praying that someone would drive by, someone who could help. And then, through the sheets of rain, I saw headlights in the distance. My heart leapt. A truck. Finally. My savior. I grabbed my phone, hoping the signal would clear, but there was nothing. The truck kept coming, headlights bright, cutting through the darkness. I leaned forward in my seat, waving my arms wildly, desperate for it to stop. My heart pounded in my chest, and I thought for sure they'd stop. But when the truck got closer, something felt off. I couldn't see the driver's face clearly through the rain, but in the back of the truck, just behind the cab, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure. It wasn't a person, not really. More like a shadow, slumped, sitting on the edge of the truck bed, barely visible through the wet glass of the window. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the rain, but then the figure moved, shifting, sitting up straight. It was staring directly at me, eyes locked on mine with a cold intensity that made my skin crawl. I froze. The truck didn't slow down. It didn't even seem to notice me at all. It passed by quickly, headlights fading as it disappeared into the rain, swallowed whole by the storm. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty road ahead. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my palms were slick with sweat. The figure. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me. But that didn't make sense. No one had stopped. There was no one else around. The night felt heavier now, the rain even louder. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. Maybe the truck was going to the nearest town. Maybe I could catch up. I started the engine again, hoping the car would start, but it didn't. I tried again. Nothing. My hope drained away as quickly as it had come. I was stuck. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. The feeling of being completely cut off was like a weight on my chest. The rain, the darkness, the isolation, it was all too much. The storm was relentless, and I had no choice but to sit there, helpless. The night dragged on. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting for some kind of miracle, but it never came. The headlights of the truck never returned. The only thing that came was the rain, the wind, and the gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. Eventually, I fell asleep. I don't remember how long I'd been asleep when I was jolted awake by a soft knock on my window. My heart stopped. The rain had finally slowed, and there was a strange, suffocating silence around me. I looked out the window, but there was no one there. The headlights from before were gone. Everything was still. I stepped out of the car, cautiously, heart still racing. I looked around, but there was nothing. No sign of a truck. No sign of anyone. Just the wet ground, the damp trees, and the dark stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. I started to check the car for any signs of damage, hoping to find something to explain what had happened. That's when I noticed the muddy footprints. They were all over the car, on the hood, the windshield, the sides, just everywhere. They were deep, as if someone had walked all around the car. I stood there, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. But the footprints didn't stop there. They led into the woods, fading into the trees. I took a step back. My breath caught in my throat. My heart was racing again, a cold sweat creeping down my back. Whoever or whatever had left those prints had been close. Too close. I didn't know whether to follow the tracks or run. But one thing was clear. I wasn't alone out here. I climbed back into the car, locked the doors, and drove off into the storm, not daring to look back. But even now, whenever I'm driving in the rain, I can't help but think about that truck, that figure in the back, and the muddy footprints that led into the woods. Something tells me I wasn't the only one who was waiting for help that night. Something was watching me, and maybe it still is. And every time it rains, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next person to break down. Story 6. It was my first night staying at the small motel on the outskirts of town, a place that felt a little too quiet, even for a roadside stop. The kind of motel you'd find if you'd been driving for hours, too tired to go further, but not quite ready to call it quits. It was dark when I pulled into the lot, the kind of dark that feels thick, like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The rain had been falling heavily all evening, and I could barely hear my own thoughts over the constant thrum against the roof of my car. When I checked in, the clerk was a woman who barely looked up from her book as she handed me the key. The fluorescent lights above her flickered faintly, casting long, sickly shadows around the lobby. Everything about that place felt wrong, but I brushed it off. A place like this didn't ask for much in terms of charm. You were just passing through, and it was enough that the bed was clean, even if the room smelled like mildew and the carpets were so worn I was afraid to walk barefoot. I parked my car and walked down the narrow hallway toward my room. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls, too loud, too sharp in the silence. The hallway was dimly lit, with more flickering lights overhead. A small part of my mind wondered if the entire place was being held together by the rain. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and tossed my bag onto the bed. The room was cold, but that was nothing unusual. Air conditioning had that effect on small motels, I figured. I went about my routine, washing up in the tiny bathroom and flipping through the channels on the TV. There was a strange, hollow feeling in my chest, like the room itself was watching me. But I dismissed it as just exhaustion settling in. By 2 a.m., I was finally drifting off to sleep. The rain had quieted somewhat, though the occasional gust of wind rattled the windows. I was on the edge of a dream when I heard it, a soft knock at the door. 3 taps, rhythmic, deliberate. At first, I thought it was the sound of the wind hitting the walls, or maybe the rain, but the more I listened, the more certain I became. Someone was knocking. I sat up in bed, my heart thudding in my chest. The knock came again, only this time it was louder, more insistent. I wasn't sure what to do. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 2:15 a.m. Who the hell would be at my door at this hour? I shuffled to my feet and moved cautiously toward the door. The knock came again, but it was different now. It wasn't a single knock anymore. It was 2, quick and sharp, like the person on the other side was testing to see if I was awake. I reached for the peephole and pressed my eye to it, expecting to see someone standing there. But nothing. Just the blackness of the hallway stretching out into the nothingness. I pulled back from the door, confused. The rain outside had stopped, and the quiet that followed felt unnatural. Everything was still. I stood there for a long moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was a trick of the wind, or maybe I had imagined it. But then I heard it, clear as day, a voice, soft and almost breathless, whispering my name from the other side of the door. Jason. The voice was faint, like it was carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. My name. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. My first instinct was to open the door, to see who was out there. But something held me back, something deep in my gut, something cold and crawling, told me not to. Instead, I backed away slowly and grabbed the phone on the nightstand, my fingers trembling as I dialed the front desk. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before the clerk finally answered. Her voice was thick with sleep. "Motel desk," she mumbled. "How can I help you?" I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what had happened. About the knock, the whisper, the strange feeling that something was wrong. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Sir, no one has been down your hallway tonight. I'm the only one working the night shift." and I haven't seen anyone go by. I could feel my heart start to race. I try to calm myself, to tell myself it was just some prank, or maybe some drunk idiot. But the way she spoke, so flat, so unconcerned, didn't help ease my fear. I hung up without another word, my mind spinning. I tried to return to bed, to settle back under the covers and force my body to relax, but I couldn't. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. The silence in the room was deafening, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. I couldn't get the whisper out of my head, Jason, Jason. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed, and I was still awake, eyes wide open, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. I don't know what I thought would happen. Maybe I thought the door would open by itself, or that someone would come in, but nothing came. Just the endless, empty quiet. I never did sleep that night. At dawn, I packed my things as quickly as I could, barely noticing the strange heaviness in the air around me. I checked out with the same clerk, who didn't seem to recognize me from the night before. She was too busy flipping through her book again, and I didn't bother trying to make small talk. As I stepped out into the morning light, I looked back at the motel, feeling the unsettling chill of the previous night settle deep into my bones. The sky was clear, and the ground was dry, with no trace of the rain that had fallen so heavily just hours before. I never went back to that motel, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, is still knocking on that door, waiting for someone else to answer. Story 7. It was the kind of night where the rain seems to come from everywhere, a steady sheet of water falling from the sky, making the world look as if it had been dipped in ink. The kind of rain that makes everything feel muffled and distant. Even the street lights, which usually gave some kind of hope in the dark, felt weak and far away, their glow lost in the downpour. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind wouldn't stop racing, thoughts bouncing from one thing to another. The storm outside wasn't helping. The constant rhythm of the rain against the window was soothing, but it also felt like the world was closing in on me. I pulled the blanket tighter, trying to bury myself deeper into the warmth. And then I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost as if it were part of the storm itself, a low thud against the house. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind moving branches, maybe a tree scraping against the roof. The wind howled, pushing against the walls, rattling the windows. I tried to turn over, hoping sleep would come, but the sound came again, this time louder, more distinct. Footsteps. There were footsteps outside my window. A slow, deliberate walk, like someone was pacing back and forth. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel my heartbeat begin to race. I didn't move at first, just lay there, frozen, straining to hear over the rain. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe a neighbor, maybe the wind playing tricks on me. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept going, circling my window, coming closer, then farther away, then closer again. A constant, rhythmic tapping against the earth. It wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. My feet were ice cold. I couldn't move. The only thing I could do was stare at the window, my eyes wide, waiting for whatever came next. The footsteps grew louder. And then I heard something I hadn't expected. A sound that made my stomach flip. A voice. It wasn't loud, just a whisper, but it was there. So close that I thought someone was standing right outside my window. It was barely audible over the rain, like a low murmur in the night. Hello. I don't know why, but I felt my breath catch in my chest. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted, but my instinct was to stay perfectly still, not make a sound. My heart was pounding now, my chest tight, as the voice repeated itself, barely more than a breath. Hello. The footsteps continued, just outside my window. Closer now, as if the person, whatever it was circling the house. The rain was pouring harder now, tapping against the roof and windows in an endless rhythm. But the footsteps, they didn't stop. They circled my house, coming closer with each step, drawing nearer to the point where I felt the person or thing was standing right outside my door. My head spun, my hands trembling beneath the blanket. I could feel the sweat on my palms, the cold creeping into my bones. I didn't know whether to open the window and call out, to find out what was happening, or to lock myself away even tighter in the dark. But I couldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something's wrong, that something isn't quite right. I could still hear the rain outside, but the footsteps were gone, replaced by the quiet, heavy stillness of the storm. It felt unnatural, too still, like the world had paused for a moment, waiting for something to happen. I lay there, eyes wide, staring into the dark, my breath shallow, waiting for the footsteps to return. But they didn't. The minutes stretched on, and still nothing. I wanted to move, to get up, to check the house, but something held me back. The fear of what I might find was worse than the fear of staying still. It wasn't until much later, when the storm had quieted down, that I finally managed to gather the courage to get out of bed. I walked to the window, my feet dragging across the floor. My mind kept racing, imagining what I might see. What could have made those footsteps? What was standing outside? When I looked out, the yard was empty, completely empty. There were no footprints in the mud, no signs that anyone had been there, no hint that anything had happened at all. The storm had passed, and everything seemed normal again. Too normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been outside, whatever had made those footsteps, was still there, just out of sight, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. The fear kept me up, the shadows in the corners of the room, making it impossible to relax. I kept hearing things, scratching at the window, something tapping at the door. But when I checked, nothing was there. The footsteps never came back. Not that night, not the next. But the feeling never left. And every time it rained, I'd hear that voice, whispering just below the sound of the storm. Hello. I still don't know who or what it was, but I've learned to sleep with the lights on. Story 8. The storm that night was unlike any I'd ever experienced before. It wasn't the usual thunder and rain that rolled through, just a few hours of wild weather that would leave you damp and annoyed. No, this storm felt different, meaner, like it had a purpose. It raged all night, battering the windows, the wind howling like some wild animal looking for a fight. The rain came down in sheets, so thick it seemed to press against the walls, like it was trying to force its way inside. I had lived in this house for years, and I'd seen my share of bad weather, but this was something else. I'd just gotten into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, when the storm really started to make its presence known. The walls groaned under the pressure of the wind, the rafters creaked, and the old house shuddered, almost as if it was alive, fighting against the storm that threatened to tear it apart. I told myself to try to sleep, that the storm was just another one of nature's tantrums, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That familiar nagging sensation crawled up my spine, that feeling of being watched. I knew there was no one else in the house. It was just me, the storm, and the silence that wrapped itself around me. But then the floorboards creaked, a soft sound, barely audible, but in the middle of that storm, it felt like a gunshot. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. The creak came again, this time louder, and it seemed to move like something or someone was walking across the floor. My throat went dry. I had locked every door before going to bed. I checked the windows too. The house was secure. So, what was that noise? I sat up in bed, straining my ears to listen. The storm raged outside, the sound of the rain hitting the roof like 1,000 tiny fists pounding in unison. The wind screamed through the trees, bending them in half, but through all that noise, I could still hear it, the knocking. It was soft at first, just a tap, tap, tap against the door, like a child asking to come in from the rain. But there was something unsettling about it, like the person on the other side wasn't supposed to be there. The tapping continued, each strike just a little harder than the last, until it was a steady rhythm, like someone's fingers drumming against the door. I told myself it was just the wind, the house settling, the storm playing tricks on me. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it wasn't real. But then I heard it, a voice. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was barely a whisper, so soft that at first, I wasn't even sure I heard it at all. But then it came again, clearer this time, and I could hear the desperation in the voice, the urgency. Let me in. I felt a chill sweep over me, one that wasn't from the storm outside. It was something deeper, something cold, crawling up my spine like fingers dragging across bone. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. I couldn't tell whether the voice was real, or if it was just my imagination running wild, but it felt wrong. It felt like it wasn't meant for me, like it was coming from somewhere far darker than the storm outside. I pushed the covers off and swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the cold wooden floor. My head swam with thoughts, each one darker than the last. I wasn't sure if I wanted to check the door. Hell, part of me didn't even want to get up, but the voice kept repeating itself, the words soft but growing more insistent. Let me in, let me in. The tapping on the door had stopped for a moment, but I could still hear it. The voice was louder now, more frantic, like whoever was outside knew I was listening and was desperate to get in. I stood there, frozen for a moment, listening to the storm howl. I tried to calm myself, tried to convince myself that it was just the storm playing tricks on my ears. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. That voice wasn't from the storm. It wasn't from the wind. It was something else, something that shouldn't be here. I walked slowly toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. My mind raced with every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. I was alone. No one should have been knocking at my door in the middle of a storm like this. Still, I couldn't stop myself. I put my eye to the peephole and looked out into the hallway. Nothing. No figure standing there. No shadow lurking in the darkness. The hallway was empty. Just the rain beating against the windows, the howling wind, and the silence of the night. But then the voice came again. Clearer. Louder. Let me in. Please let me in. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice wasn't outside the door anymore. It was in the hallway. It was inside the house, and it was closer than before. I backed away from the door, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified, paralyzed, caught between fear and confusion. The knocking started again, this time fast and frantic, as though whatever was out there was losing patience. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the window, pulling the curtains aside, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I peered out into the yard, my eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement, any shadow that could explain what was happening. Nothing. The yard was empty. The storm had turned the night into a black void. But there was no figure standing there, no shadow of a person waiting for me to open the door. The yard was completely still, the rain falling in sheets, and the wind whipping through the trees. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I turned back to the door, my skin crawling. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed felt worse than any sound. The voice, it had stopped too, but I could still feel it. Deep inside me, a cold, gnawing presence that told me this wasn't over. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. The storm eventually passed. The rain slowed to a soft drizzle, and the house grew quiet again. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I lay there, wide-eyed, terrified of what might happen next. In the morning, when the sun finally broke through the clouds, I checked the door. There were no signs of anyone ever being there. No footprints in the mud. No marks on the door. Nothing. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. The storm had passed, but the fear stayed with me, hanging in the air like a thick fog. And to this day, I can't help but wonder if that voice will come back, if it will find its way to my door again,